Cool. Good evening, everyone. Happy New Year. Thanks for joining us tonight. This is our second backcountry chat of the evening. Um, this chat is brought to you by the Peter Ingalls Avalanche Education Fund. As many of you know, Pi was a great friend and colleague to many of us, and avalanche education was one of his many passions, and we do this in his name. And thanks to you for joining us and helping to do your part to create a safer backcountry community in Telluride this winter. We also couldn't do this without our sponsors, and we need to thank them as well. Telluride Mountain Guides, San Juan Outdoor Adventures, Mountain Trip, Telluride Helitrax, and Telluride Mountain Club. And tonight, we need to give special thanks to the North Face Remade program. They've given special support to this chat tonight. And the Remade collection is the result of the renewed design residency, which is a program to educate designers on the principles of circular design and to make products repairable, reusable, or recyclable. And that's awesome. And you can get the chance to win a one-of-a-kind remade piece from the North Face in Telluride. From January 8th to January 22nd, head to remadecontest.com, complete the form, and get entered to win a special remade piece. Check out the Mountain Club's Facebook page and Instagram accounts for more details. Thanks again to the North Face Remade collection. And also need to thank Heidi Lauterbach from the Mountain Club and the Pi Fund. She's done a great job getting these chats organized. And Heidi and Matt Steen from Telluride Helitrax are gonna help us tonight with Q&A. And tonight we have Ryan Howe talking about risk, and we're going to have some time for Q&A after that presentation. Matt's going to give an update, or we'll have a little roundtable on the state of the snowpack, and then we'll talk about what we're going to do next month. But tonight, Ryan Howe is going to talk to us about risk assessment and treatment. It's a super apt topic. We have a very tender and unpredictable snowpack right now, and it's hazardous. Hazard plus exposure equals risk. You know, we had a slope triggered by a patroller today at the ski resort. You know, we'd thrown bombs, and the second skier to cut across the top of it triggered a sizable slide large enough to bury someone. So even with bombs and skiers on the snowpack, it's still touchy. So anyway, Ryan, for those of you who don't know him, and let me introduce myself if you don't know me, I'm John Tuckman. I'm the snow safety director at the ski resort here. Ryan Howe has worked full-time as a blue-collar avalanche professional since 1998. He would say that his career path has followed a wobbly orbit as a guide, educator, ski patroller, operations manager, and author. We know him now as the owner of Telluride Mountain Guides and a colleague with us on ski patrol at the ski resort, husband and father of two. So Ryan, please take it away.
Oh, wow. Can you guys hear me? Is this working? Sweet. Thanks, Tuck. Thanks, Heidi. Thanks, Matt. Let's see if we can get this thing working. Man, I hope everybody out there is having a good winter so far. I know lately I have been feeling quite mortal. Not sure why. Maybe it's the snowpack, maybe it's the pandemic. But yeah, it seems like a good thing to carry into the backcountry, or mortality, or at least a solid sense of it. And it's not always a bad thing, I don't think, to feel mortal. It's probably a good, honest thing to bring in the backcountry. Can you guys hear me okay? Is this working? Hopefully.
Yeah, sounds good, Ryan.
Sweet. Cool. You know, that kind of honest sense of mortality is kind of the foundation of our risk assessment and treatment in the backcountry. There's a lot of ways that we get distracted and forget about the fact that we have a rare opportunity on planet Earth, and maybe we shouldn't risk it just to get our jollies in the snow, but it's I think a place to start from. So let's dig into it here. Avalanche risk assessment and treatment. And this is really an approach as a lifelong art in the mountains. Patience and discipline is kind of a core principle when we're assessing and dealing with risk in avalanche terrain. You know, this can be super confusing, it can be exhausting, and it's really tempting to just kind of go with our gut, or, you know, potentially just lean on the actions of others. But as we've seen, this can be pretty catastrophic. Ultimately, this requires, you know, that we develop these skills of disciplined evidence gathering, and really the personal character trait of patience is super key in this effort. Fortunately, we have a lot of pretty well evolved tools, conceptual framework tools, cognitive triggers that we can use to aid us when we're assessing risk in the backcountry. So in this PyFun backcountry chat, we'll try to keep it pretty practical, kind of quick and dirty. We'll go after a Dirtbag risk assessment and treatment by a factor of pi. Some key takeaways in case you get super bored, in case I'm long-winded. If you need to just tap out early, here's the hook. We'll just lead with the hook. Our goal here is to match terrain selection with the avalanche hazard forecast. So the CAIC forecast. We have an incredible resource in Colorado, and our goal is to match our terrain selection with their forecast. More specifically to our wild and woolly San Juan snowpack, we need to identify persistent problems in the snowpack and apply patience. Terrible word. Wonderful skill, patience. Capture change before catastrophe. That's really our main job in the backcountry, is to try to capture change before things get catastrophic. And always a good skill for awareness: stop, look, and then go. So let's dig in here at some terminology, kind of some ABCs. Ingredients of an avalanche. I think we all know these, but it's worthy of review. A slab is a cohesive or contiguous chunk of snow that could stay together long enough to slide downhill. I kind of like to think of a slab as a continent of snow, and plate tectonics certainly is a decent analogy within a snowpack. Weak layers. It's a layer of snow that has the propensity to propagate a fracture, allowing an overlying slab to slide downhill. We've got some notable weak layers in the San Juans. It's kind of a terrible thing to be proud of, but we have really some of the best weak layers anywhere. It's pretty cool. It's horrible. But probably our most notable are persistent grains or persistent weak layers. And more specific to avalanche problems, they create a persistent slab problem. But persistent grains are a type of large, angular, faceted snow grain that just won't go away. Like a super annoying neighbor, just sticks around, holds tough. These grains resist deformation and fragmentation, which is really the erosion process in the snowpack and also presented by nature and weather. Super key thing to grasp about persistent grains is that they are strong or relatively strong in compression, so getting squished down, but they're very weak in shear. So when you tilt these layers at an angle, slope angle, they are very weak. And that is why slope angles are super important when you're dealing with persistent slabs or persistent weak layers. You can get away with compressing them on certain slope angles, but as soon as you roll, past 30 degrees typically, or if you want to really tighten your margins like 34 to 36, but that's very dangerous to run margins that tight, they fail in shear. The last avalanche ingredient or of the notable three is the bed surface, and that's the layer of snow or earth that a slab could slide downhill on. Avalanche problem types or avalanche character. This is good terminology to kind of work into your personal rubric so that you can understand the forecast, but also so that you can communicate with a common language. You can see it's quite a list. These are condensed in your forecast. The CISC forecast lists these as, the number one or number two, not always in a ranked order, but a list of avalanche problems for the day. This is a pretty complex chart here. It might be worth digging into later, but it does indicate the different types of avalanche problems. And oh, do we have problems? So many problems. Among these is the fact that snow is super variable. It's hard to predict. It barely fits into our universe. It's more sky than it is earth, even though we travel upon it. It exists at the triple point between liquid, solid, and vapor. You could argue that snow is a transient cloud that is shape-shifted into a solid just long enough to appear as though it actually exists in any given form or another. The main takeaway is that snow is very unpredictable, particularly in a shallow snowpack like we have. Our weather warps the snowpack, and we all witness that when the wind blows or the temperature rises and our powder crops wilt. You add to snow the fact that humans are predictably unpredictable. We're not near as good at thinking our way out of trouble as we are at thinking our way into it. And we're prone to psychological gymnastics. We're very good at it. Gold medalists. Oh, thank God. Something we can control. Terrain. It's the cause of and solution to all of our problems. And this is probably a key thing, and I think we all are keenly aware of this, but our terrain selection above all else determines our level of exposure to avalanche hazard. What is avalanche hazard? Here's a pretty textbook definition. A potential for an avalanche to cause damage it is important to remember that avalanches affect other things than us, structures, infrastructure, individuals. The main takeaway here is that avalanche hazard is something that we need to assess or derive from a public resource, and it is different than avalanche risk. And of course, we do live in Hazard County here in the San Juans. We've all seen this North American public avalanche danger scale, but this is really good to dig into. And I think a lot of times we miss the value of this thing. It's really well done, but it's maybe not modern enough to catch our attention. It comes with travel advice, comes with the likelihood of avalanches. It comes with the avalanche size and distribution. We get this every day. It's a super valuable resource. One thing that's worth zooming in on here, moderate. Human-triggered avalanches are possible. And they really mean that. And I think our forecast center in particular is quite good at sticking with the definitions of our danger levels. And that comes with pros and cons, right? They're trying to be as objective as possible. But that means what it means. So knowing what moderate means is really important. So this is a resource that is super valuable, I think, that we just often overlook. So if you get a chance, dig into the language on that public danger scale. Really valuable. So what is avalanche risk? It's the probability or chance of harm to a specific element at risk determined by that element's exposure and vulnerability to avalanche hazard. So more specifically to us humans, we can see here that our exposure is a factor of our spatial and temporal scope. So where we are physically positioned and essentially how long we are positioned there. And you can see how that really does affect your exposure, where you're at, where you stop and start, and how long you stand there. Vulnerability, I think, has some variable definitions, but in general, it's our level of preparedness to grapple with or ability to avoid the avalanche problem of the day. How we communicate, how well trained, how equipped we are, but also our fitness, our skill set, our habits, our self-awareness, our resilience, our patience, our discipline, our ability to control our impulses, our primal urges to shred. These are hard things to control, especially the more pent up we get. So it's a tricky situation. I think Bill Allen and Jonathan Cooper are going to get into group communication. And that's super valuable. So I won't hit heavy on that, but that is not to be overlooked in importance. So how do we treat risk and reduce our exposure? There's some really good tools out there. I think one of the most simple and probably just baseline tools is the avalanche terrain exposure scale. And this is from the folks at Avalanche Canada. So we'll buzz over to their website. This is a really valuable resource, and I don't want to underplay the value of our state avalanche center because they do an incredible job. But Canada has a huge tax base for avalanche education. They have a lot of roads and infrastructure that are impacted by avalanches, and they have a lot of recreational users and guide companies, and they're just Canadian and they're badass. So the 8s, this is very simple, but it's also very useful. And you can read through this on your own. But essentially the AITS divides our terrain selection into 3 categories: simple, challenging, and complex. And those words mean a whole awful lot: simple, challenging, and complex. They have definitions, but they correspond with the danger rating. So you can grab your danger rating, you can grab the terrain that's appropriate with it, and you're pretty much good to go. If you stick with that, real good chance until you're old and gray. But it's important to understand what the definitions are. So simple terrain has exposure to low angle or primarily forested terrain. Some forest openings may involve the runout zones of infrequent avalanches, but there are many options to reduce or eliminate exposure. Not a ton of options like this in the San Juans, which is tough, but we have some for sure. There's plenty out there. I think we all know where they are. We don't want to tell anybody, but generally we should spend a big chunk of our backcountry, lifetime in simple terrain. If we want to stick around for a long time and do this as a lifelong art, simple terrain is our bread and butter. We got to get good at it, whether you're on a snow machine or powder skis. Not a whole lot of snow machining around here. Challenging terrain has exposure to well-defined avalanche paths, start zones, and terrain traps. These are all terms that we should be able to define. I think we have a whole wealth of challenging terrain in the San Juans. Complex terrain. I'm thinking of a place that we all know and love and probably spend way too much time in. Bear Creek. Complex terrain has exposure to multiple overlapping avalanche paths or large expanses of steep open terrain. Pretty straightforward. The one thing we don't have in Bear Creek, thank God, is glaciers. Although that would make for better kayaking and probably better rock climbing. Pretty straightforward. This is a simple tool that really can help a lot when we're trying to decide what to ski. But ultimately, we want to match our terrain selection with the hazard rating. I think if we can enjoy this process, which is pretty difficult, but the process of planning, waiting for things to be good, hanging out, being patient, instead of obsessing over the product, like I skied this line and I got these pictures and I got all this and I'm so stoked, and the product was good. If we can learn how to enjoy the process, that leads us to a place of gratitude and patience, makes us more control our impulses. You can see this, and this is from Avalanche Canada. If we make this a cyclical process or a positive feedback loop, we can build off of it. And we find these feedback loops throughout nature, throughout evolutionary history. If we create a positive feedback loop, it's more likely to perpetuate positive outcomes. So basically, we're saying that you really can't ski Bear Creek when it's good. Sort of, kind of. Not really. I mean, there are days when the window is open and that terrain lines up with the forecast. But how often do we find ourselves back there when that's not the case? So either our actions are saying we're we don't care and we're just doing it, or our actions are saying, well, at a micro level, we disagree with the forecast. And that there's no moral judgment on there. But if that is the case, then it should be legit. You know, if we are disagreeing with the forecast, then we should have a pretty hefty data set of evidence that we have gathered on our own that justifies it. So what if we run tighter margins? What if we have a higher risk tolerance? This comes with a heavy burden. Micro forecasting or personal forecasting, where you're picking a isolated zone or even a slide path, and you're zooming in on that, and you're saying that I have gathered enough evidence that I feel comfortable with my terrain selection. That's a heavy burden. It's the equivalent of surfing a super heavy surf break. And plenty of people do, but there's also plenty of kooks out there that maybe shouldn't be. So you don't want to find yourself in the category of the kook out there surfing a heavy break. Some things that go into our public avalanche forecast, what the gals and guys at the CAIC do to produce this public forecast. They use a version of the conceptual model of avalanche hazard. And this is a really valuable resource. We'll dig into it. It's not to empower people to just kind of wildly become their own forecaster, but it's a good baseline of information to understand how a forecast is produced. And that leads us to this forecast. Now, a lot of us, you can see this is from today. Yeah, today. Mike Barney, just an incredible resource to have in the North San Juans, a legit skier, avalanche educator, you know, just an incredible human being. You know, he puts in a ton of work, and everybody else puts in a ton of work to issue this, but there's a ton more information. We have a good summary. You got your avalanche problems listed, but that's not just it. You got weather. We scroll up here and we go to the forecast discussion, which how many of us actually read the forecast discussion? But look at this. Boom. Spooky moderate. Pretty good piece of information. Why is it spooky? Read on. There's more info here. There's also ways that you as an individual can help put more of a pulse on what spooky moderate means. But when in doubt, it's perfectly fine to trust your local forecaster. The conceptual model of avalanche hazard, the most notable thing here is this was really a North American and is a North American effort. It's not the gospel. There's certainly plenty of things that don't lend themselves to using this conceptual framework, but it is a pretty valuable resource, and it's based on heaps of operational experience from all the people listed on the bottom of this page here. You know, you got Ethan Green, Carl Birkland, Bruce Trimper, and then you got some heavy hitters from Canada as well. So it's pretty big effort and a very useful resource. This is the condensed version of it. We list our avalanche problem. We try to locate it. We try to determine its sensitivity to trigger, its spatial distribution. That gives us the likelihood of an avalanche. And then we put that on a graph with the destructive size of the avalanche. And that really is the factor of the potential volume and velocity of snow that could come hurtling down the mountain and produce an impact pressure of a certain degree. So that's where you get your D scale of a D1, a D2, a D3, D4, and a D5, which some folks would argue do not exist in Colorado until, well, March 2018. And then we started to reevaluate that. These are all things that take a ton of evidence to quantify. We can't just throw darts at this little graph and, voila, we got our avalanche hazard. Each one of these steps takes an incredible amount of evidence gathering to come up with an answer. And it takes an incredible amount of consensus amongst a group. So it's quite a process. Bear with me here. I'm going to bust over to this conceptual model poster. I think it's worth digging into if you guys aren't asleep yet. Hold on one second here. Okay. So this is from Avalanche Canada. This is the kind of text version. The folks at Silverton Avalanche School have come up with a really cool kind of visual learner version of this. But the text version is really good at indicating how much goes into this process. I mean, it doesn't even fit on my screen what's involved. Hey,
Ryan.
Oh, yeah. Did I lose you?
We can hear you. We just can't see the screen.
Oh, let me try again here.
But thank you.
Let's try this. Sorry. Is that better? That should be it.
Yep, we're there. Thanks.
No worries.
Awesome. God, I hope people are still awake. If that's the beauty of this, I guess you can fall asleep at any time. Anyways, you can see that this is quite an involved process. At a professional level, we're defining operational context. At a recreational level, defining what your group goals are as a group is super important. And if you have a huge disparity within your group, it's important to recognize that and come up with a consensus. We establish the context that we're forecasting for. In most cases, in a recreational setting, you're looking maybe at a single slope or maybe, a drainage if you're going to be working different aspects within a drainage on a ski tour. You define your temporal scope, and then you got to dig into your avalanche problems. How do we determine what our avalanche problems are each day? Pretty happy that we have forecasters that are getting after this. Some things that are really useful as we travel in the backcountry, and this is really helpful language, like a common language that we can all communicate in, are the distribution of the avalanche problems, whether they're widespread, specific, or isolated, and the sensitivity to trigger. Explosives are really handy for determining the sensitivity to trigger. A good way that a recreational skier can get an indication of what explosives are doing, you can take observations. So if you're hiking up the Gold Hill Ridge and you look over into Prospect and you see on northeast facing slopes that the storm slab is reactive to explosives. There's a foot of new snow and you're seeing a foot or a foot and a half deep crowns all across the ridge. That's a decent idea that it's reactive. And that's gonna be some persuasive evidence for your decision to ski on other northeast facing aspects. But you can see that if we get good at this language and get good at using this conceptual framework, it helps to organize all of the observations that we have in the backcountry. It also makes us better at potentially offering observations to the CAIC as individuals. And then we can participate in this collective attempt at really quantifying our avalanche problem spatial distribution and sensitivity to trigger. Anyhow, real complicated process. Sorry if I'm scrolling around here, but a really valuable resource, conceptual framework to kind of organize just all the observations and all the busy brain work that we all have when we're out in the backcountry. Okay, let's get back to this. Okay. Hopefully I still have you on the screen. Is that working?
Yes, sir.
All right. All right, so we'll power on here. This is straight out of the brain of Douglas Krause. He did borrow it from a really valuable document called the ISO 31000. It's a pretty boring read, but there's a lot of useful information in it. It's a risk management document. So that's not a very good sell, but it has some super pertinent stuff. Within it, they use this concept of identify, analyze, evaluate as a risk assessment and treatment process. So when we apply that to avalanche risk, this is what Doug kind of came up with. We ask ourselves the questions, what could go wrong? And this really has to do with the distribution and sensitivity to trigger of our avalanche problems. How bad could it be? That's a tough one. Ultimately, as a recreationalist, we just need to ask ourselves, could it produce an avalanche that is big enough to kill me? And that has really beyond the destructive potential definition implications, because even a D1, a relatively small and harmless avalanche, could wash you off a ridge and over some cliffs, and you could die. That is not its destructive size, but that doesn't really matter. The fact that it's bad enough to cause that is enough to make you adjust your risk treatment. And that's the next question. What do we do now? And this is the horse that, will be flogged forever in our risk treatment, but it comes down to terrain selection. It always comes down to terrain selection. The tighter our margins are, the more precise our terrain selection needs to be, down to every turn that we take. Now, the safer bet is to widen our margins. The saying that the greater our uncertainty, the wider our margins need to be. That's the long game. But conversely, the tighter our margins get, the more precise our terrain selection needs to be. So this is super exhausting. There's no way to get around it. We should probably just go bowling. But when we're in doubt, if we return to simple terrain, go back to that Eights definition of simple terrain, that's the long game. That's how we keep doing this until we're, old ninjas out there just meditating on top of a mountain. If we stick with simple terrain, it makes the long game a lot more attainable. But to avoid mental fatigue, we can apply these tools whenever change is imminent. And that is really the key skill, is anticipating change. And our goal is to capture change before catastrophe. This skier in this picture did not trigger the avalanche that almost hit these people's hot tub. But you can see the idea here would be to capture this change before you end up in this exposed position. A decent mantra, I think, is just the idea of stop, look, and then go. So whenever change is imminent, prior to that, we can be having conversation and being super chill in the backcountry. But as soon as the hairs stand up on the back of our neck, or as soon as change is imminent, we stop. We take observations, we plan, and then we go. Many things can change throughout the day or throughout the month or throughout the week. We have changes in our snowpack that's influenced by weather, wind transport, solar gain, temperature change, precip intensity or snowfall, a rain on snow event, which is becoming more prevalent in our range. Obviously, recent avalanches are collapsing and cracking, which has been disturbingly normal as of late. It's kind of like normal this year to have collapsing and cracking. I don't know how normal that should be. Terrain changes. I like the weird word aspangulation. I think that's an Andrew, what's his name? Shooting gallery in the Wasatch. Anyways, aspect, slope angle, elevation, and I like to throw the configuration of the slope in there, how it's shaped. And if we're traversing across a change in configuration or about to, that should trigger an assessment. Human changes, huge list. Bringing it down to just the basics of hydration, nutrition, thermoregulation, we're less likely to be volatile beings if we are well hydrated, well fed, not too hot, not too cold. There's a lot of research in how humans make just wildly myopic decisions when they're hungry or thirsty or cold. And as Edgar Allan Poe put it, the imp of the perverse, which we all have perverse impulses to shred, but being able to recognize those before they become too compelling inside ourselves or inside the group is super useful. Quick review here. Try to apply these tools when change is imminent. And some takeaways. We're trying to match our terrain selection with the forecast. It's okay to trust your forecaster. It's okay to trust yourself, but make sure that if you trust yourself, that that's coming from some very disciplined evidence gathering, that you've been out in the field, you've been studying the snowpack, and you have a weighty data set that you're basing your decision off of. Really pertinent for any season in the San Juans, but especially this year, identifying persistent problems and applying patience. And our main goal is to capture change before catastrophe. Hopefully someday we'll be doing this. It would be nice. Soon enough.
Thanks, Ryan. If anybody would like to ask a question, just feel free to just put one into the chat or the Q&A. Raise your hand. I think Heidi or I could probably see that. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in, you know, Ryan, that was great. Really interesting stuff. And this is something I know that we think a lot about as professionals. And it does seem really simple to, the way you put it, just boil it down to the forecast and terrain selection, you know, let the danger rating sort of guide your exposure, and you kind of pick your own risk level. So I guess my question is, do you know of any good resources to understand terrain? I mean, I've definitely talked to plenty of people who look at this and are, well, I look at the map and this thing's only 25 degrees. And I'm like, well, I've skied there before and there's a 35-degree convexity that will get you, and we don't yet have a great avalanche terrain exposure scale like map for the area. How do you go about, other than like kind of detailed terrain knowledge of your own, like how would you recommend people get their hands on that kind of stuff?
So yeah, I think you hit on a really good point. We have huge advantages with like CalTopo or Google Earth, and they're beyond macro, but they're not quite micro. And that's also what makes it really cute, really cool. It's a human component. We have to get to know the terrain. And I hate to abuse that analogy, but it's kind of like getting to know your paddle out to your local surf break, or it takes time. It's not something that you just jump right into. So creating margins in that situation is really important. Like you're pointing out, somebody might look on a topo map or on CalTopo and they say, oh, this is like 25 degrees. It's definitely simple terrain, but they don't zoom in quite close enough, or they don't observe on the skin up the configuration of the slope and the micro configuration. And that can be super consequential. And that's where patience just comes into play, and using those observation skills, really developing a keen eye for slope angle. I think the best way to approach any of these things is like any skill, you practice. So guess your slope angles and then measure them and try to refine it. But the guess and measure in sequence situations is a good move for developing a good eye for slope angle.
And thanks for that. And I do appreciate your observation that using this type of methodology to kind of manage your risk does really force you out of terrain like Bear Creek when the skiing's good, at least with midwinter hazards. The one exception would be I think last winter we had this kind of Goldilocks period, and it was right after the holidays, maybe right around now. It was like incredible powder skiing, and we were like moderate, not spooky, moderate trending low, and stayed that way for a while. But that's very much the exception rather than the rule. And I guess the question is, the people that are skiing it all, and by people that are skiing it all the time, I'm not talking about anybody specific, but there are a lot of people that go back and take exposure pretty regularly, and what do you think? Do you kind of, and look, I do it myself on my days off. Sometimes I go back there and take the exposure, and it's probably, some kind of moderate that's a little more considerable than I'd like. But, how do you kind of de-rationalize that as an ongoing habit? You know what I'm saying? As opposed to, like kind of doing it and saying, okay, this is great, let's go do it again tomorrow. And just sort of unconsciously letting that understanding of risk like wear itself down, how do you train the conscious mind to understand the level of risk on a daily basis when you're doing something over and over again?
That is a tough question. I wish I knew the answer to that one. To me, just all about being as rational as possible in your decision making. And I've been probably the guiltiest of many for making irrational decisions in that particular piece of terrain. But I like to go back to the idea of basing your decisions off of evidence gathering. And I do feel like you can micro forecast in Bear Creek, but it's hard to get away from both the complexity and the potential consequence of that piece of terrain, not only to yourself, but to others. And that's a tough one. And I don't know how we'll ever get around that. But if you go back to evidence gathering and the idea of weighty evidence and not just persuasive evidence, a lot of times we make decisions based off of persuasive evidence, like there's tracks, or it hasn't slid, or I feel really good about this. And that's persuasive and it has its place. But I think the weighty evidence, where you're actually out probing in the snowpack, you have a hardness profile of the entire zone. And hardness profiles are super valuable because you have lemons in your snowpack that are very evident when you have big jumps in hardness. And you can gather that just by going out and probing in the snow.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, and digging quick pits, like all of these things reduce spatial variability. They give you a pretty good idea of what's going on at a micro level.
Yeah.
But ultimately, that's such a heavy piece of terrain. And I think because it's so close to the ski area, we forget that it is like the definition of complex terrain. And that's a hard one to get around. It's heavy.
Well, yeah, and there's a question from Coop that's a good question, and we can come back to this, but it's kind of leading into something that I want to talk about too, which is, what are your thoughts on the inherently high risk of traveling in avalanche terrain with a persistent slab snowpack, in combination with the collective, quote, normalization of deviance that exists in this community with this persistent snowpack structure? That's a good way of putting it, Coop.
That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I almost feel like persistent slab or persistent grain. And I mean, right now we have maybe a not so impressive depth hoar problem for us. It's pretty normal, but then you couple that on really any aspect with east, and maybe beyond that, we have this like crust facet, near surface facet thing that's buried. It's 8 inches almost of buried near surface facets between two crusts, and that's like our mid pack. And if you look at the grains in there, they look like depth hoar. They're these like super hexagons and angular gnarly facets. That's our mid pack right now in a lot of places.
Yeah.
That's insane. It's like a persistent slab moderate with a big old asterisk on it, but it's hard to fit that into a public bulletin without reading the forecast discussion. But like you say, normalization of deviance, like what I just said right there, indicates normalization of deviance. I'm saying things like a not so bad depth hoar problem, right? Like in most snowpacks, people would be like, what is a not so bad depth hoar problem? We just get used to it. We get used to these persistent grain or persistent slab problems. And I don't know, how you fix that. Sensitivity to trigger is a big one. I think maybe not this winter, but when our persistent slab problem goes stubborn or unreactive, that's when we start to feel a little more comfortable, but it's still there. So I think just having a grasp of what a persistent slab problem is, what it means, is super useful. So when that pops up on the CIC forecast, that should really trigger that asterisk in our brain. Like, this is slightly different, remote trigger, shallow to deep is in play. The shape of our terrain and where we're skiing is in play, and our margins, just with that element in play, our margins become tighter. A persistent slab problem.
Yeah, and I mean, what I did want to come back to in this was the fact that we've had 4 avalanche fatalities in the state this season so far, 3 incidents, clearly, all tragic accidents. And I've read the CAIC reports, but outside of that, I really have little independent knowledge of those incidents. And, we're not here to kind of opine on what happened, but the commonality in the first 2 incidents of 3 fatalities was that those victims were, not young. I mean, they were all in, I think they were all late 40s to 60s, very, very experienced backcountry travelers, very experienced with that terrain, and, in one case, former avalanche professional. And, so, again, like, that makes me think about the exposure side of things, but it also goes to, I think, the question Coop's trying to answer in a more broad sense of like at what point, at what point do we just kind of become inured to the risk of the persistent slab problem? I think underplaying the level of our exposure, because if you were in California with a buried NSF layer, 2.5 feet down, nobody would be skiing. They wait for the sun to come out in a week. So, I mean, we've all been doing this for a while, and we've all seen it. And I guess, the question of is it a normalization of is it a true normalization of deviance here? And are we just like fooling ourselves?
Yeah, I think anybody that lives in any other snowpack would say yes. But it's also the reality of our situation. Really, for me, it gets back to those fundamentals of persistent grains are relatively strong in compression, but weak in shear. And I think having a keen eye for slope angle is, you certainly shouldn't lean on that to run tight margins, but it's a really important skill if you're traveling in a snowpack that has persistent slab problems. Your slope angle assessment has to be really spot on. Otherwise, it's probably not a good time to be out ski touring. And it's arguable that even if your slope angle assessment is, bar none, it's still arguable to be out in those conditions. But we have to develop the habits and skills that Mother Nature requires of us if we're going to grapple and be out in Mother Nature. So I think knowing, I think what Coop is saying is super valid. Just having that in the back of our minds, that am I just kind of becoming jaded to the fact that I'm traveling on a persistent slab, or am I really aware of my surroundings and am I doing my best to prevent peril? So I don't know. That's a tough one. Most people in the Wasatch are appalled at our snowpack, or folks in, British Columbia are appalled by our snowpack. So I think it is normalization of deviance in general. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but it probably.
I remember a time when a lot of this stuff didn't get skied until spring. Cool. Well, we should move on. One of the things you mentioned about the facets being strong in compression and weak in shear. One of the things we are seeing a lot of right now is collapsing debris piles. So you've got a slide coming down from above, sometimes from high above over a cliff, landing on top, creating yet another slab, and not triggering a buried weak layer. But then when you get your skis down into something, it will shear out those facets and the whole debris pile will collapse. So scary snowpack, which may be a good segue into Matt, if you want to talk about the snowpack for a while, if we have time. And
sure.
Folks, feel free to pop into the chat with questions.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. And John, everything is very eye-opening, and it's always good to hear it, and always good to go over these things for us that have heard it a lot, and for those that haven't heard it a lot. It is complex. It is a complex year. It tends to be complex every year. Some of the things that just kind of came up with, like this persistent slab problem, which I think that, if you're reading the forecast every day, you're getting pretty tired of hearing the persistent slab problem, that it's just there all the time. And one thing to highlight, at least for myself and for those that want to follow the snowpack, is that even though the persistent slab problem is there, it does change slightly every day, but it trends in one direction or trends in another direction with the weather and all these different or storm cycles or wind events. Wind is really tough to forecast. It's hard for these models to predict that it's going to be gusting into the 40s at 1 o'clock today, and you might be on top of a mountain. So knowing these little nuances with the weather and what they might do to the snowpack, and knowing what's underneath the snowpack, I think is really important. So, and these broad strokes of moderate to considerable, well, and Ryan, you were pointing it out, like today, the avalanche center, went the avalanche hazard rating went from considerable to moderate today. And for those that follow it, there might be a question of like, well, why is it moderate today and why was it considerable yesterday? And it does trend towards like a plus and minus of sorts to these hazard ratings. Is it moderate plus or is it considerable minus? Or like, what is it? So, and what contributes to that? And as a public forecasting center, the Avalanche Center, CAIC, they think about this more than you'd think of what kind of message are they trying to relay to the public on what kind of hazards are out there. And seeing a hazard rating go from one to another, either up or down, it's pretty easy to forecast a higher hazard rating if a big storm comes in or some other big weather event. But it's a little more difficult to take that hazard and start notching it down and try to paint the clear picture for the public on why is it going from considerable to moderate. And as Ryan was pointing out, reading into the North American Public Avalanche Danger Scale, it's more than just 5 colors. It's more than just a couple of words of considerable or moderate. You got to read into that and kind of see what those definitions are. And knowing that moderate does, it's not a green light by any means, and it's more of a generalization. of type of terrain you might, or type of avalanche hazard you might encounter in the terrain out there. So, this year, the snowpack, I kind of, you know, the commonality of people saying, oh, we have facets every year, and you know, we live in this continental climate, which is mostly shallow snowpack and cold temperatures and warm days, and it just cycles these snow grains through diurnal fluctuations, which is basically just breaking these snow crystals down. I've just felt that this year's just, there's been a lot of faceting. There's been big faceting processes, and most of the snowpack you dig into is really loose, nothing very stiff. But when it does come in as a storm, and those new snow grains they like to link together really well, or you get these new snow grains and they blow around and they like to link together really well, they become stiff, and they are a stiffer slab. And a week or so ago when we got snow, and that was our slab avalanche that we were seeing all over the place, and it was a stiffer slab. Well, since Christmas and the holiday period, the snow has just been sitting on the ground, and it's basically rotting, and it's faceting out. So it's becoming less of a beautiful snowflake that likes to hold hands. It's becomes this like angular grain that wants to butt elbows with everyone. So that slab is breaking down, but it takes time. And so we've gone from considerable for, you know, I'd have to look it up, but it's been weeks, and it's been trending down slowly because of what? Well, it's because the snow grains are breaking down, and the slab is not as communicative with its surrounding. So that's been the general trend lately, that it's been coming down. Since we've had the last snowstorm, you know, there's been some cold days and cold nights. There's been a handful or a half a dozen or more wind events. So these seeing snow blow off the peaks, and you know, it's taking snow from one slope, and it's either blowing it back into a cloud, or it's depositing it on a leeward slope. And so it's creating new problems, you know, isolated problems. And we use these words, isolated and specific, and you know, to the layman, it might just sound like we're just talking with the English language, but these words actually hold weight to a forecaster, and they actually mean something. So diving into that conceptual model is great, and I'm glad Ryan brought that up. And it does seem really complex and like kind of overwhelming, but if you really wanted to dig into a forecaster's narrative, and you know, they're using those words very specifically for a reason. If anyone has any questions on the snowpack, I mean, the biggest story of the day is we went from considerable to moderate, and that's why I just wanted to touch on that, and reasons why the hazard has been trending slowly down, but it's been so slow because of just how weak the overall snowpack structure has been this year. So any other comments from, I guess, yeah, you guys, Ryan and John?
Is it going to get better?
Is it going to get better? Yeah. You know, it might get worse before it gets better, but it will eventually get better. It's going to melt, and we're going to be, you know, like Ryan's going to be kayaking this stuff, you know? So, yeah, I mean, I think a question did just pop up, but I don't see it here, but is it going to get better?
It's from Carl Welter. Do you think the current pockets are specific or isolated?
Well, Carl, what's the definition? You know, I know Carl, so I can give him a little bit of grief, but, you know, isolated is, you can check me on this, but isolated is, it's like, and I was about to use the word specific, but it's in, it's not found everywhere in the terrain. And, you know, I've got my my conceptual model here that is worn and tattered, but sorry, let me see I think the current pockets are specific. I've been saying that they're in specific terrain features. They're in deeper fetches where the slab can reside. You know, the snowpack right now on average is about 80 centimeters to 100 centimeters. So, you know, like 2 to 3 feet deep. There are deeper pockets of snow out there, and they're in these leeward fetches where wind can deposit these snow into these features. But a week and a half ago, when we had that last storm, that storm slab was more blanketed across the terrain. And since then we've had a bunch of wind, and the snowpack has settled, which means that, like, yesterday the snowpack at PHQ was at 31 inches, and today it's at 30 inches. So it's you know, it's settling out, and so the uniformity of that slab is deteriorating over time, and gravity's tugging on the terrain as well, and you know, the snow is constantly moving and shifting and getting blown around. And
I think you're hitting on the difficulty of pinning down a persistent slab problem, because I think that is why they choose the language of persistent slab and not persistent grain. It's like you just talked about how we bumped down to moderate because the slab is disintegrating, but the persistent grains are still there. And so to answer Carl's question, when we're talking about distribution, and I'm assuming you're talking about our persistent slab problem, it's good to go back to evidence. So if a problem is isolated, the evidence is hard to find. So if we're talking about the persistent grain, it's not very hard to find it. So it's got that would bump us to specific. But kind of what Steen is kind of pointing out is, like, it's hard to pin that down because we're talking about the slab, and the slab has started to disintegrate. That's why we bumped to moderate. But answer your question specifically, I would say that it is specific. The grain is almost widespread, but the slab itself is specific. The evidence is not hard to find, so I wouldn't put it in the isolated category. Whatever the case, it's still there. So I think our risk treatment solutions are still with slope angle. And that's really kind of the bare bones of it, is because the problem is still there, the grain is widespread, the slab itself is specific. We're only left with slope angle as our choice, and you kind of got to keep it sub 30 if you're running wide margins.
One tool that I've brought up in the last few days with our guiding group and is knowing what the problem is, and then going out and trying to either see where it is or see where it isn't. And the way you can do that is with the combination of digging a snow pit and trying to identify, like in a lower angle slope, like identifying, okay, this is how much snow is on the ground in my geographical location. Oh, here's the slab, or here's not the slab. And then as you're traveling through the terrain, having your probe in your hand and feeling where it is and where it isn't, and looking around you and seeing where it may be or it may not be. Because the persistent slab is not everywhere. It is specifically in terrain. So I just pulled up my form, but it exists, but it's only in portions of the terrain. The summer landscape is undulating and rocky or grassy or whatever. And there's drainages and there's ridges. And when you blanket the snow over it over the course of a winter, those subtle features disappear to the naked eye or to the eye on the surface. And so some of these areas may only be 30 centimeters deep. And so there's not a persistent slab there, but you go about 20, 30 feet over, and now you're in 4 foot deep snow, and you found where the persistent slab resides. So it's you can find it, and it's not everywhere. Like, we do live in a really sketchy snowpack area because it's just because of our geographical location and how much snow we get. And so the persistent grains, as you say, they are there and they reside for most of the season, but it's how we navigate around them, and at certain times and making those right decisions. I had a question for you, Ryan. So in a land of stokeness, because everyone's here to get high on stoke, how do you navigate high stoke and with daily avalanche hazard? Now, this is for you and your partners.
Oh man. If you asked me that like 20 years ago, I would be like, what's the problem with high stoke? But I mean, I have 2 kids now, so I think it's easy. I just, I don't need to scare the shit out of myself every day. I still need it though, and I always will. And that's a hard thing to navigate. I think recently I've, like stoke is incredible, right? It drives progression. It keeps us motivated, keeps the fire burning. So it's certainly not something to just squelch and, extinguish. But I think if you can couple it with this kind of discipline, I think Bruce Lee, generic example, but any martial arts expert combines the fire within with a good self-discipline. And I think if you can combine that with evidence gathering, and there are great ways to use non-standard observations. I really feel like we went a little overboard with the craftsmanship of our science, but it's important. You can't have legit science without craftsmanship. But we've kind of downplayed the importance of these non-standard observations like probing and hand pits and quick instability tests, like doing an ECT in like 5 minutes just to get an idea of propagation yes or propagation no. Just coupling the stoke with observational skills, I think, helps keep a balance. That's my general idea, but at this point in my life, I am content with like getting home to hang out with my kids. And that's super cheesy. And I would have laughed at that in my 20s, but that's just the way it is. For me.
Yeah, of course. So, so I think we're all along on this evolutionary path of how to navigate our stoke and get out there and come home to your younglings or anything really, just to come home and put your head on your pillow. I just doing a quick poll on the last pie chat that half of the participants that were joining were new to the community. So I just encourage a lot of mentoring out there of the people that are new, to look for a good mentor, and I know that's probably a general term of knowing what a good mentor is, but just be open to learning a lot, and just knowing that it is very hazardous out there, and to take things slowly and approach things very cautiously in the mountains, especially in the southwest part of Colorado, and more or less the entire state of Colorado at this point. But to approach slopes very cautiously and with margin, like you were saying, Ryan. So and I just brought up the high stokedness because there is a lot of stoke in this community, and that's great. And hopefully the avalanche forecasters aren't out there, or you don't look at them as just the squashers of stoke, but really everyone is just trying to make sure everyone is safe and making proper, educated decisions, or if there is uncertainty, then to, ratchet it down a notch or two. It is okay to hike back up if you're committing into a slope. It is okay to go back down a skin track. There was a close call just the other day near Silverton of someone who deployed their airbag twice. And I don't know if I've ever heard of that being a reported story of someone pulling their airbag, using it, and then stuffing it back in, and then using it again. And it's okay to hike back up. It's all right. We know that the snowpack isn't super stable right now. So just being okay with that, and then supporting your partners in those decisions. As professional guiding groups, we make decisions as a group, and there's so much weight in that. I mean, it's just put one person out there to make a decision of a yes or no, or go or no go. I mean, it's tough. It's great to bounce that off of other people. And even if you think you don't have that experience out there, you can contribute to the conversation, and you could potentially change the outcome. So I encourage everyone just to be very active with their partners, and talking about the conditions, and reading the forecast, and following it on a daily basis. And if you miss a couple days, read the past couple days, and digging into that CAIC site, and looking through all the observations in this area, if you're going to be skiing this area, and just talking to your friends about it. And it's more than just just stepping out of bounds and skiing over snow. So it is more complex, but incremental baby steps. Like I'm going to use your surfing analogy again, but you learn how to surf in the whitewash, and then you go out and get the double overhead, and that sometimes takes years. So I'm not saying that's the timetable, but just respect the mountains. And let's see, I'll go a closing remark. A friend of mine who was teaching me how to surf, and he said something like, never turn your back to the ocean. So never turn your back to the mountains. Always be attentive to it. So on that, I'm going to pass it off to our MC, John Tuckman.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Ryan, also for both of you guys for great presentations and a lot of insights. And we got a lot of things to think about this winter. So that'll wrap up our January chat. Please join us next month. Our next chat is going to be on Monday, February 1st. I think that's 4 weeks from now. That is going to be communications and decision-making with Bill Allen, Fisher, and Coop. Maybe we can talk more then about normalization of deviance. And before we leave, we need to thank our sponsors once again, Telluride Mountain Guide, San Juan Outdoor Adventures, Mountain Trip, Telluride Helitrax, and the Telluride Mountain Club. And a real special thanks to the North Face Remade program, collectively repairing and upcycling apparel. Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you next month.